Tip FM's Tip Today.
With Slattery's Garage, puck on. It's time to change. Test drive the award-winning range of Peugeot hybrids and fully electric vehicles at Slattery's Garage today. See slatterysgarage.ie.
Now, I'm glad to be joined in the studio once again by John G. O'Dwyer as we delve into the history of Ireland. I think we're going to start today with Bloody Mary.
Yeah. Put out two Bloody Marys there now in front of me on the
Don't
desk.
be
It will
tempting.
be grand.
Don't be tempting
And
me
the
now.
show can only improve after that. Yes.
She was remarkable, wasn't she?
She was, absolutely,
Yeah.
because Henry had broken with the church, but his son then, Edward, he was a Protestant, and he started imposing Protestant doctrine. I said Henry died a Catholic. He started bringing in Protestant doctrine in from Europe, but then he died relatively young. In fact, he died as a minor, and then the eldest daughter, who was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon and Henry, but Catherine was a devout Catholic. Her daughter was Mary, and she really believed in Catholicism. So she wanted to change Britain back to being a Catholic state again. And you know the way monarchs don't often give up power. She gave up power. She said, "Okay, Your Holiness, you now run the church again. I don't." So she handed that back to him.
Was that because she was devout, or was it pragmatic in some way?
I'd say she was pretty devout, almost to a point of being sort of fanatical about the whole thing.
Fundamental.
She was absolutely a fundamentalist. There's no doubt about that. And she then earned the title Bloody Mary because she actually began executing Protestants. And she, not just in the worst possible way, she would burn them at a stake. That is the way she did it. So that showed very much fundamentalist type of principles. But even though she was a Catholic, that didn't mean she was the Queen who introduced the first plantation to Ireland. Would you believe that?
And I was going to ask you about her relationship with Ireland.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a happy one.
No, it wasn't. I mean, she still wanted power and she wanted control, and she tried to plant Laois and Offaly. Now, the O'Moores and the O'Connors didn't particularly like that. They went into the Shnee Blooms, and that was not a particularly successful plantation there. But you know, she was. So you've got, if you were back years ago, you would talk about Laois being the Queen's County, called after herself, Offaly the King's County. And I remember old people saying, "You're going to Dublin." I stopped in Maryborough. Did you ever hear that?
I did indeed.
That's Maryborough, and that's called after herself. So she gave her name. It was changed back to Portlaoise, but I remember the old people still calling it Maryborough. And in fact, it was, it could quite easily have been, had she been a long-lived like Elizabeth, that England would have remained Catholic and stayed Catholic. But everything turns on the head of a pin, like a seesaw. She was only there 5 years, and she got some kind of cancer, some kind of a tumour, and she died without any issue. And then her half-sister, who was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, she was a Protestant, and she took over, and she was there.
Is that Elizabeth then?
Yeah, she was there for 45 years, right. And that's what I suppose reinforced Protestantism, because she was a Protestant. Now, she wasn't a Protestant in the way of fundamentalist. Initially, she kind of was a bit let live with the Catholics. In other words, they were supposed all to be Protestants. They practiced a bit quietly in that. She didn't mind too much, but she made herself back then straight away. She kicked out the Pope and made herself the head of the church, and with the Act of Supremacy, and then he brought in a Book of Common Prayer. Everybody was supposed to go to church and do that. Some people remain Catholic, but they would actually go to a Protestant church. But that was only for the aristocracy, really. The ordinary people could check what they were doing. And of course, Ireland remained Catholic.
All right. So I was just about to say to you, so she didn't, did she not attempt to change that?
Well, she would have liked to, and they sent in missionaries in, but look, they were on a hiding to nothing. Remember, she didn't control all of Ireland. She didn't really control Munster, where the Fitzgeralds were. She didn't really control the north. She didn't control that at all, where the O'Neills and the O'Donnells were. As well as that, these evangelical missionaries coming in, they didn't speak Irish. And even though the aristocracy may have been speaking English a bit, Irish was the language of the common people. And you see the same thing. It may have been a bit. Now, people liked Catholicism as well, the ritual of it and that kind of thing. But again, if you take the Highlands of Scotland, again, because that was Gaelic speaking,
so they had no way in to influence.
They hadn't in the way St. Patrick, I suppose, spoke Irish. So she would have liked to, but her primary thing was to get control of Ireland, because at this stage now, religion is becoming the big divider, not nationality. People divide on grounds of religion. And now you have the powerful countries of France and Spain who are Catholic, and she's beginning to worry about an invasion through Ireland, through the back door. And as well as that, kings are by their nature. They like power, they like influence. For example, if you take the O'Neills, the O'Donnells, Fitzgeralds, they were nominally subjects of the English king, but they were really operating themselves. They wouldn't pay any taxes or doing anything like that. So she wanted to change that, but she wasn't a fundamentalist. She didn't really worry too much about Catholicism. She wanted power for herself. But things began to change then, and you had what you would call, what she wanted to do then is extend her control. So what she did was she started creating counties, the counties we have today, and putting sheriffs in to take power away from the Irish, to take it away from the O'Neills, the O'Donnells. She started doing that. But that's the interesting thing, because it's not an Irish thing. It's Elizabeth bequeathed us the counties. And if you think about it today, when Tip are playing Cork, the GAA sprouted then on the national identity associated with counties. But it's Gloriana. Yeah, it's
wow.
yeah. She gave us that. She gave us the 32 counties. And that's how the GAA, because there was that, you have the regional site, a clear regional identity. And that's what works in sport.
When she drew the lines around those counties, I mean, what prompted that? Were there existing areas that became counties?
No, not really, to be honest with you. No, there was nothing at all. It was more or less trying to divide it up into areas where you could put in a sheriff, but it would also be where some of her own people controlled it as well as that. So she started doing that, and just as a fairly arbitrary division, dividing up the whole thing. She would put in 6 sheriffs. Fitzgeralds didn't like it, of course.
And the North and South Riding, for example, in Tipperary, was that much later?
That was later, yes, but she set up Tipperary. Right. That was later. Okay. She set up Tipperary, though, as a county.
Did she execute Dermot O'Hurley?
Yes, she did, yeah. You'll know about that.
The Archbishop.
The Dermot O'Hurley band. And I'll probably get to that. What happened then was she was clamping down and closing in on the Fitzgeralds. They were losing their traditional powers, and they rebelled. But she wasn't having any of it. So she attacked Munster and laid Munster to waste in the first Desmond Rebellion. Remember, in those days, war wasn't pretty. You would go along, and how you would deal with people who were up in the hills or who were running in front of you, what you would do is you'd kill their cattle, burn their houses, burn their crops. And that's what happened in Munster. Now, the Fitzgeralds were Catholic, and at this stage, the Pope gets involved. So the Pope comes in here, and because she has attacked Catholics now, he says she's a heretic. He has excommunicated her. But not only that, he wants all her subjects now to rebel against her. Any Catholic has a duty to rebel against her. Bad idea. That meant straight away Elizabeth viewed every Catholic as a heretic. So there was a change in attitudes, and the live and let live began to die away a lot.
She viewed them as an enemy, you mean?
She viewed them as an enemy because the Pope was saying they have a duty as Catholics to overthrow her as a Protestant king.
Okay.
And then to add to that, in 1580 there was a second Desmond Rebellion. The Fitzgeralds came back. They had been abroad, but what did they come back with? Soldiers sent in by the Pope. That made it absolutely clear at that stage. Again, she attacked Munster. Again, Munster was devastated. Fitzgeralds were all murdered. And, that was... And at this stage, Elizabeth then goes back and looks at what Mary did and said, this is hopeless. We'll never get these people to be satisfactory. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plant Munster. And you got the plantation of Munster then, where the Catholic huge amounts of land were kicked off, and you had the plantation. And the idea was that you would bring in powerful people in England, her own support, like Walter Raleigh, Edmund Spencer. They would come in and they would get land here. But what they were supposed to do was get English tenants to come across and work the farm. But just a war-torn place, and they felt, a lot of them didn't want to come, so they could never get the numbers. So what actually happened was they actually had to keep the Irish honest tenants. It was different in the north, and that is why then the Munster plantation never brought in the amount of Protestants that it would have been, you would have seen later in the north. So it was always a minority.
And what about the north? Because that's where we really associate plantation. Again, was that later?
That was later, yes. And at that stage, that was later. That was under James. That was later. Okay. And at that stage, they wanted to bring. They found they couldn't get enough English to come in. But up in Scotland, there were Presbyterians, and even though they didn't like Presbyterians, they thought they were better than Catholics. They might be more loyal, and they were hungry for land. So how the north changed, because what happened was because as tenants they were able to bring in Presbyterians. They brought in some from England as well as that, but it's mainly the Presbyterians. And most people think the North is Protestant. Well, broadly it is, but basically the majority there are Presbyterian. That was the difference from Munster. They were able to bring in Presbyterians from abroad. But you get back then, Dermot O'Hurley then came in. I mean, the Pope must have hated him because he gave him the short straw. He said, right in the middle of the Second Desmond Rebellion, you're now the Archbishop of Cashel, off you go. So he went off.
He must have known.
Absolutely, and he arrived in here at the worst time when Elizabeth was really clamping down on Catholics. There wasn't a hope. He stayed up. He hid up in Slane for a while, and then he even went down to Thomas Butler, who was very close to Elizabeth. Now, he was a Protestant, but he was sympathetic towards the Catholics. But even you'd think he could protect him. Even he couldn't protect him, and he was taken up. He was eventually captured, and he was brought to Dublin, and he was tortured. And one of the way they would have tortured people in those days, to get him to renounce, he wouldn't do it, you see, renounce the Pope and renounce Catholicism. They would get this steel kind of a boot, big boot, and put it on your feet, pour boiling water into it.
Stop.
Yeah, that's exactly,
stop. But I thought she executed him under the banner of treason as opposed to
well, that would have been it.
Was that it?
Well, yeah, but there was no evidence at all. I mean, he wasn't... I'm sure he wouldn't have... he would like to get rid of Elizabeth. But she was saying that he was actively fermenting a French invasion of Ireland. Right. There is no evidence that he was doing that whatsoever. He didn't have the contacts. He'd come straight from Rome or whatever. But, but if you're thinking that, was he a supporter of hers? No. Would he probably have liked to see her overthrown? Yes. But there was no evidence. So it was a court-martial. Yeah. It wasn't a proper trial where he could defend himself and he was taken out. And of course, in Cashel, you were brought up with the Dermot O'Hurley Pride.
Absolutely, indeed. No, what I was going to say to you was that in terms of the plantations, from the English point of view, did they work? Were they successful?
The ones in Munster didn't really work. The reason was that there was actually Munster was laid waste a third time because then the Ulster, O'Neill and O'Donnell rebelled and they sent down soldiers to Munster. And they laid waste to Munster because at that stage the planters were in Munster. That was 1596, so there was English planters, and kicked them all out again. That would have been the likes of Sir Walter Raleigh, who brought the potato into Ireland. So, and that ultimately led to the famine because we became dependent on the potato. And then when the potato didn't work, he brought the potato. Edmund Spencer, the poet, they were all kicked out, and the Munster plantation was virtually completely dissipated by O'Neill and O'Donnell. It didn't work. The one in Ulster worked better because they were able to get enough people to come in and work. Whereas fundamentally they were dependent on the native Irish Catholics.
And the spotlight on Munster, John, was that because the land was so good?
Well, it was. The land was good. That's why she spotlighted it first. But as well as that, O'Neill and O'Donnell were more powerful. But again, the complications of history. We see O'Neill and O'Donnell as great Irish nationalists. But actually what happened was, during the Second Desmond Rebellion, they wanted to curry favour. Well, O'Neill did. He wanted to curry favour with Queen Elizabeth I. And even though he was a Catholic, he fought on the Protestant side down here and decimated some of Munster. So, the way... history never has nice. Well, he's a Catholic. He's good. He fought for Ireland or whatever. These people are bad. History is endlessly complicated. But in the end, he got the same treatment as Munster. Much later on, he didn't like it, and then he rebelled like the Fitzgeralds, and that led to the 9-Year War and the devastation of Munster again.
And did the strategic positioning of Ireland come into this at all in terms of British enemies overseas?
Yeah, well, that was huge. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And then remember, in the middle of all that, in the middle of all this turbulence, she knew that France and Spain were trying to get rid of her. The Pope was urging Spain to do it. So they sent the Armada. The Armada didn't succeed, but it all revolved around the storm. She knew she'd had a very close call, and she was worried that Ireland would be used as a backdoor to get into attack. And what would happen is then she was afraid O'Neill and O'Donnell particularly were in cahoots with the King of Spain, that he would land forces in there, they would take Ireland, and then they would have a base to invade England from the back door. So for strategic reasons they were really afraid, and that would go on for 200 or 300 years, that Ireland would be the back door for an invasion of England.
What happened to her? To Elizabeth?
She just died eventually. She was there for 45 years. She died eventually, and then what happened was all of Henry had 3 children. and they were the Tudors. But there was none of them. Catherine of Aragon didn't. Catherine of Aragon will say Mary Tudor. She had no children. She died relatively young. Elizabeth was famously the Virgin Queen. She died, and Edward died when he was a minor. He died as a teenager. So there was no issue. So at that stage, what happens is then a kind of a cousin of Elizabeth's, who was James VI of Scotland. He became James the first of England. But that was it. But the 9-year wars almost broke Elizabeth. She had to fight it. So she fought in Ulster. And initially, the Ulster O'Neill and O'Donnell did very, very well against her, because you were fighting. But I didn't get that point. It was easier to attack Munster as well, because, it's very easy to go from here to Dublin. The south of Ulster, if you look at the map, is all lakes, mountains and bogs. It was always very difficult to attack it. The Normans had never managed to get a foothold in there, and it was very costly. And initially, when they went in there was battles like Contiverate, the Yellow Ford and the Curlew Mountains. These guys were fighting on their own territory. The English didn't know the territory, and it was generally by ambush. So they were being defeated. But in the end, Elizabeth was determined, and what she did was, we can't get in from the south. She said, we'll be defeated there. So she sent an army, and they landed at Derry behind O'Neill and O'Donnell. At that stage, they began to realise, the boys began to realise, we really are under pressure. We need French assistance. They were getting guns and supplies up to that. They now needed French assistance. So there was about Spanish assistance. So the Spanish king sent about 6,000 soldiers, which probably wasn't quite enough, but only about 4,000 that made it to Ireland. The others had to turn back. Again, storms, and they landed at Kinsale, very wrong end of the country. O'Neill and O'Donnell had to march down there in winter. They were now fighting in territory they didn't know, and the Spanish were surrounded there. Mountjoy, then the English had the Spanish surrounded, and then they surrounded the Spanish. But before they could, they surrounded the English. Before they could attack, the English had a cavalry charge against them, dissipated their ranks, broke up their formations, and the battle was lost. And that was the end. That was the end, really, of Gaelic Ireland.
It's fascinating. Have you any more talks coming up?
Yeah, well, I will be. Yeah, I'll be going down now to Fermoy. I think I'll be going to Fermoy in March, and then I'm going off down to. I'll tell you on the next one, and then I'm going off down to the Wander Wild Festival in Killarney as well as that, to give them a chat as well.
Very good, but they're going great for you.
Yeah, with great talks, numbers and great. Yeah. And I mean, I'm talking about like the medieval period, like here, but even like here. I think if you kind of you manage to present history in interesting fashion, everybody is fascinated by it.
Well, that's for sure. I certainly am. Great to see you as always, John. Thanks very much indeed. John G. O'Dwyer there. Let's take a break. Back in a moment.
Tip FM's Tip Today.
With Slattery's Garage, Puckon. It's time to change. Test drive the award-winning range of Peugeot hybrids and fully electric vehicles at Slattery's Garage today. See slatterysgarage.ie.